There we go. I'd like to welcome everyone to our free webinar sponsored by the online peer mediation platform. Just if you're watching via video and you're not aware, the online peer mediation platform was a JAMS funded project in 2014 to provide web presence for peer mediation in the form of resources, conflict resolution modules, conflict resolution practice for students, and then, of course, peer mediation services for schools that lack a peer mediation program. In addition, we do provide other resources, so if you're ever interested in reaching out to us, please go to our website, which is the online peer mediation platform, and you'll find events and resources and all kind of good stuff. Now, on to our webinar for tonight. So I'd like to introduce our guest host tonight, and this is a colleague and friend of mine, Vickie Shoap from Fairfax County, Virginia Schools. And I don't know if you know this or not, but Fairfax County, Virginia is the 10th largest school district in the nation. And Vickie was telling me that they have over, what'd you say, 200 schools, Vickie? Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Over 245 schools and centers. Mm-hmm.
Oh my goodness. So very, very large school district. And you have over 190,000 students. Is that right?
That's correct.
From 200 different countries. That is amazing.
That's correct.
So I'm sure you guys have a little bit of conflict there, right?
Just a little.
Just a little.
Not much, just a little.
So Vickie, and I'll let her tell you more about this, but you guys started your restorative justice program around 2011. And was that
yes? That's when my position was hired. But before that, there were pockets of restorative practices done here and there by the conflict resolution specialist who was mainly doing peer mediation. But yes, in 2011 is when the school board really started the full district implementation.
That's awesome. And so just a little bit about Vickie herself. She has 25 years experience in the restorative justice field in both criminal justice and schools in Virginia. And Vickie, you are a national restorative justice practitioner and trainer in the principles and practices of restorative justice in schools and juvenile courts. Vickie is the former restorative justice coordinator for the Prince William County, Virginia 31st Judicial Circuit and Juvenile Courts, and the former president of the Restorative Justice Association of Virginia. Vickie has written restorative justice training programs and facilitator manuals for the Virginia Department of Education and the Supreme Court of Virginia Office of Dispute Resolution. So she is much versed in the field of restorative justice and practitioner that we really wanted to have on tonight. So Vickie, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. I'm going to start with just a little bit about, I'm going to do maybe like a 30,000-foot view of restorative justice and restorative practice. Folks may know a little bit about that, so I won't go too much into the theory, but talk a little bit about the continuum of restorative justice and restorative practices internationally, but also what our focus is here in Fairfax County. Then I'll talk a little bit about the shift from a traditional response to discipline issues to restorative response, a little bit about the history of restorative justice, and then a little bit more specific to our implementation here in Fairfax County public schools. So, and for some reason, this is not forwarding my slides. So,
okay, so
I'm not.
Okay, so what we can do, let's see. And Karen can help us. Karen, on the slides, what's the best way to tell her how to forward it? Just hit the enter, or should she go to view on? What's the best way to explain that to her?
Because I understand what you're experiencing right now, because when you're in presentation mode, the screen is a little bit bigger. I think if you just forward your arrow, it should advance.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing. Yeah, I'm kind of hitting the forward arrow, but it's not.
Okay,
it's not forwarding.
Try enter. Try that one.
Which one?
Try enter. Try enter.
No, it's not forwarding.
All right, so let me give you what I do. Okay, so here's what we're gonna do, guys. Give us and everybody that's on is a Zoom. We're we know how this works. We have the Zoom
Oh,
night.
great.
Okay. So
That
don't
helps.
Okay. All right. So I want you to stop sharing for a moment.
All right.
And then I want
Okay.
you to put your presentation in not presentation. I just want you to show it just like you were editing it.
Yep, there you go.
Okay. And then I want you to
All
share it
right.
again.
It won't even let me get out. Okay, there it is.
Okay.
All
Take
right.
your time. It's all good.
All right. So it's now in the regular mode.
Wonderful. Okay. Then you remember how to share it again? Go down to the bottom and.
Did that work?
There we go.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now
Is that better?
Yes. Now
Sure, that's perfect.
you'll be able to click on the side and have no issues now.
Then I can just click on each.
Yeah.
Okay, that's what I'll do. I'll just click with my. Is that better?
Yes.
That's perfect. Wonderful.
Okay. All right.
Good job.
Excellent. So you can all see it now.
We can all see it.
All right.
We're good. Okay.
All right, excellent. So I'll start with just going through some of the principles of restorative justice. And we typically, when we do presentations for our administrators, we typically start with principles because so much of what is out there right now with restorative justice is just really lacking what we find that going through the fundamental basics. So what I'm showing you tonight is different pieces, if you will, different slides from what we typically use for when we train administrators and when we train school staff. So these are the 7 principles that all of the restorative justice that we do here, all of the applications and FCPS are based on. Restorative justice focuses on the harms of wrongdoing more than the law or the rule that's been broken, more than, the discipline code. What does the discipline code say? And, what is the rule about that, or what does the law say? The focus is really on the harms of wrongdoing, which is a fundamental concept of restorative justice as opposed to the law or the rule. It doesn't mean that that's not important. It just means that we're really looking at the harm. Also empowering victims. Excuse me. As you know, there are not many victim services in schools. And so when there's an incident in a classroom or in a hallway or at a sporting event, many people are impacted or harmed by that. And there's not always a process to help students be able to walk through that. So if there's a fight or an incident in the classroom and everyone feels harmed by that, we often just say, go back to, everybody get back to work, we remove the offending student, but there's a lot of harm there. And sometimes the students have anxiety about coming back. To be in the classroom with that particular student who might have been involved in something. So we really offer victim services and show equal concern for the needs of the people who are harmed in schools by wrongdoing. And then supporting the students who've harmed others in the same way, and making sure that we encourage them to take responsibility for their actions. Go to the next one. Provide opportunities for dialogue between students. Participation is always voluntary. So in restorative justice, what we're doing is we are offering the opportunity for folks to sit down together to talk about what happened and who was impacted by an incident and how that harm can be repaired. And it's always a voluntary process. And involve and empower the affected community. When I was growing up, schools were part of a community, and in some of our communities, like Alexandria, where it's more of a city, the schools are part of the community, as opposed to some of our larger high schools that are out in the suburbs, that aren't really connected to a community. And oftentimes when there's an incident at a school, the community around the school is affected. So for example, one of the first cases I did here in FCPS was an elementary school that was spray painted by some middle school students on the outside over the weekend, and right beside the school was a Baptist church. And of course they were very offended coming to church on Sunday morning and seeing all this graffiti on the side of the school. So what we did and what we might do then is bring the church, people from the church and members to represent the church into a restorative justice process so that the students can understand that they're connected to a greater community. And the folks in the church community would have an opportunity to talk about how they were affected and how they were, victims of the incident and how things might be made right with them. So it helps to build community, not just in the school, but in the surrounding community. And then encourage collaboration and reintegration rather than punishment and isolation. That's my favorite principle. I think that we've seen a lot of isolation and punishment post zero tolerance across the country. And what restorative justice really does is encourage people who've harmed each other to come together and have a discussion about what happened. And it's really education, which is really what discipline is all about. And then, of course, showing respect to all parties involved in wrongdoing and involving all of them equally. So those are the 7 principles that everything we do is based in that restorative justice theory and in those principles. This next slide is just a little bit about the history of restorative justice, and I put this in here. We typically use this slide to train folks in our system. The purpose of this is really to demonstrate that restorative justice is not some new flavor of the month, I always say, or not some new program, you know, that some director's program or somebody comes in for a few years and says, you know, this is what we're going to do, and I'm going to mandate that we do things this way, and then there's a shift, you know, until someone else comes into that position. And restorative justice is really changing the way that we do juvenile justice, especially, and school discipline across the country. There are now 48 states that have restorative justice legislation in their criminal code, mostly for juveniles. Virginia, we just passed legislation in our state 2 years ago, last legislative session in January, to allow my school facilitators to obtain police reports for kids who are charged in school to try to reduce that pipeline of kids going into the justice system from schools. So that legislation in Virginia enabled us to be able to work with those kids who are charged criminally. Before, we wouldn't have been allowed to see that police record. There was always a line of confidentiality. So the legislation that's happening around the country is really enabling restorative justice programs to be happening in schools and in juvenile courts. So this slide really just demonstrates that restorative justice has grown internationally. It's a new field of study. It's a new discipline. There are many universities now that offer a master's degree, as you might know, in conflict resolution, but specifically in restorative justice and restorative practices. So that's really exciting. On this next slide, what we do in Fairfax County Public Schools is we really separate restorative practices and restorative justice. And really, we put a lot of effort into the language around this because it can be confusing. For example, there are some school districts who use restorative practices as their umbrella term, if you will, or restorative justice as an umbrella term, and it ends up encompassing a lot of different practices. So we really wanted to separate that restorative practices are really not restorative justice. Restorative practices are skills that are often utilized in a formal justice process, but they can also be used in classrooms to build relationships and create connections and prevent harm and violence before they occur. So an example of that would be we train teachers how to use restorative language in the classroom, how to talk to kids, you know, rather than what did you do this time, you know, to change their language a little bit to what happened to you this morning that you would be coming into school and behaving like this. So it's changing the language to what happened as opposed to what did you do this time. So we train teachers to use that language. We also train them to facilitate classroom circles in the morning, which can be used to build relationships and create connections, but then they can also be used for escalating conflict. Once teachers are trained to resolve, we hope, you know, 80–90% of incidents that happen in the classroom so that they don't have to rise to the level of discipline. When that does happen, and there has been wrongdoing or harm or a criminal offense, then the restorative justice process is used, and that's the formal victim-centered process for responding to harm and wrongdoing. And restorative justice is not really, it's not a program, and we say that all the time. It's really a philosophy, it's a mindset based on a set of principles which we've already talked about for responding to crime and wrongdoing. So we say that a lot in our system, that it's not a program, it really is a philosophy, and it's changing the philosophy of discipline and the mindset around punitive measures and zero tolerance as opposed to a more restorative justice philosophy. So in this next slide, This is our continuum of practices and training in Fairfax County Public Schools. So if you start at the bottom left corner where it says restorative practices for prevention, you can see a little bit of what I just talked about. We use restorative practices in the classroom, the philosophy and the language, so that's available to all teachers. Can come to an academy class in the summertime when they're off, or they can come during the school year and learn how to use those practices in the classroom. And then that red line is there to indicate that anything above that red line requires training and certification. And the reason that we created this is because there's a lot of, as you probably know, there's a lot of restorative justice information out there. And right now it's kind of the buzzword, it's kind of the, you know, the hot thing out there. And whenever that happens, you know, people rush into communities, charge a lot of money for restorative practice trainings or restorative justice trainings, and then leave the community. And people are left with no mentoring and no follow-up. We believe that it's serious work, and particularly when there's been a crime or someone has been harmed, that people need to be highly skilled and trained to do this work. And that, you know, you can't just train somebody in a day or two and have them pull people together. So we have a series of training for anything above the red line. So as the seriousness of harm increases, the levels of training increase. So when we talk about preventative circles, those would be used, restorative justice, for attendance groups, where we have kids meeting in circle on a regular basis to be able to form connections. Kids who are having a hard time coming to school, maybe for minor disputes where school counselors or teachers may hear about something that's escalating, some kind of harm or situation in the community that's escalating. Bullying education, relationship building, that would be more of a preventative circle, and our staff is trained to facilitate those circles. Then as you go up that continuum, the student-led restorative justice, we have that at a few of our high schools, and that is for academic integrity issues. So we have some schools in this county, our county, who are very high-achieving schools. We have some of the best schools in the nation for science and technology. They don't have a lot of discipline issues. The kids there are, you know, it's very hard to get in there, and it's a privilege to be there. And so they typically don't have discipline issues, but they have academic integrity issues because the pressure is so intense, you know, to get straight A's. And these are the kids who go to Ivy League schools, and there's a lot of pressure. And so they had some academic integrity issues where, you know, kids would cheat, they would have their phone in class or whatever, and they would get a warning the first time. And there was almost always a second offense. So the Student Honor Council really advocated to use restorative justice, and now they're finding that there's not a second offense. So students actually learn their lesson the first time because they have to sit with the teacher in the circle and talk about what happened and how cheating can harm the school culture as well as the teacher-student relationship. So that's all led by students. And then at the top of that continuum under intervention is the Restorative Justice Conference. And that's the circles that we use for more serious incidents. And that would be for school discipline response. So administrators often use restorative justice in lieu of suspension, or if there was a serious fight or incident, it could be used with a few days suspension. The idea is to reduce the time for the students out of school. And then those eligible criminal charges for our Alternative Accountability Program, which is our program where our SROs, our school resource officers, who are Fairfax County police officers, there's one in all of our middle and high schools. So we have 51 school resource officers, and they're able to send eligible criminal charges to our AAP program for a restorative justice process in lieu of them filing a complaint. So it's actually a pre-diversion program. Those students are not court connected. And so we've been able to reduce that schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline that we talk so much about by almost 10% in the first year, and we're working on 20% for the second year with a hope to eventually reduce, you know, the full number of kids that are entering the justice system through our schools. So that's our Alternative Accountability Program. The next slide really demonstrates what a restorative practices circle might look like. That's mostly used for prevention. So again, to build relationships and connections in the classroom. We find that the stronger those relationships are, the more academic achievement the students can reach because they have a better relationship with teacher. And also the attendance circle programs that I told you about. and prevention of escalating conflict, also team building. We do a lot of restorative practices circles for team building, both for adults and for students. And then there's the restorative justice circle process for intervention. That is used once there has already been wrongdoing or an incident or a criminal charge. And in that process, what we call the restorative questions, we look at what happened. We use a talking piece in the circle, the tools of restorative justice. It's typically a circle with of chairs with no table. Again, with a highly skilled and trained facilitator or facilitators. We talk about what happened and who was harmed or impacted or affected. We changed the language based on the age of the students and also culturally. Here in Fairfax County, many of our facilitators do speak different languages, but we also have interpretation. We have 7, all of our documents are translated into 7 languages, and we typically have parent liaisons from around the world who can come and translate for us, particularly if we have an African, for example, language that we don't have a large population. We may get a parent who could translate that language, but typically we have translators in that circle. So we talked about who was harmed or who was impacted or affected, and then how can the harm be repaired and whose responsibility is it, whose obligation is it to repair that harm. And then there's an agreement that is written between all the participants in the circle, if it's a restorative justice circle for intervention, including the administrator, including the school resource officer. Everyone impacted has an opportunity to talk about what should happen and what steps should be taken to make things right. So that's the restorative justice circle. So then this is just a little bit about the restorative practice questions that I mentioned. On the left side, you can see the I statements, and I think all of us learned these. I'm not a big fan of I statements because from my perspective, and I think from a lot of people's perspective, you're telling the student how you feel. It makes me uncomfortable when I hear you tease others. A lot of times that's what the student is going for. You know, you're telling them how you feel and how you're being affected. Restorative justice is more of an inquiry. It's more of a motivational interviewing. So you're really asking the student, it's student-led as opposed to adult-led. So what happened, rather than it makes me uncomfortable when I hear you tease others, you may say to the student, what happened or what is happening right now? Rather than, I hear you teasing other kids and it makes me uncomfortable. You're either making a statement or you're telling them how you feel, but when you say what happened, they say, well, she came over to my desk, and they start telling the story, and there's accountability in that. And then what were you thinking at the time? Well, I was thinking that she's always talking, and, you know, you start hearing the reason why. And as we all know, especially teenagers never know why when you ask them why, but there's accountability and the why comes out. And then who is being affected by your behavior right now? Again, that's connecting them to the larger community. Well, I guess you are, because you can't teach anymore, and I guess the students are. So then you're connecting them again to how they're affecting others, which teaches that empathy. And what impact is this having on you right now? You know, what's happening to you right now? Because now you're in trouble and now the class has stopped, that kind of thing. And then what can you do to make things right? And so those are what we call the restorative questions. And we train staff to use those questions one-on-one with students and with each other as well, anyone that you're in relationship with. What we say is never bring 2 or more together and try to use those students. So that's where the training comes in. You can start using these questions right away when you're talking with students and working with students involved in wrongdoing and practicing these questions. Really, you get better and better at them. It's when you bring people together and parents are involved and you have a circle of 10 or 15 people that you really want to make sure that people are skilled and trained at using these questions. So that's really the basis of the questions that we use. This next slide is a little bit about the restorative discipline paradigm comparison. So typically when we do this in the training, we do this in 2 voices, and it's just me tonight. So clearly the offensive behavior means that you broke the rules or you broke the law. And in a restorative paradigm, it means that you violated people and relationships, and particularly in schools, it's all about relationships and the violation of those relationships as opposed to just breaking a rule. In a traditional discipline process, administrators, at least in our system, they determine what's going to happen. The assistant principal typically is in charge of discipline, or the dean of student services, and they decide what's going to happen according to what the school discipline code is. In a restorative justice process, everyone impacted determines it. So, for example, the parents of the victim, so-called victim, or the parents of the student, or students who've been affected by some wrongdoing, always want to know what happened to the other kid. What did you do to the other student? And our administrators are not allowed to share that information because discipline is confidential, just like juvenile justice is confidential. But the parents of a victim or the parents of a student who's been impacted are sitting right there in the circle. And so they have an opportunity to say how they would like to see happen, as well as what the administrator would like to see happen. And so it really gives the victims of wrongdoing, of crime, it really gives them a voice in the process, just to have a conversation with the people who've harmed them. And then the focus in traditional process is on the offending student, where the focus in restorative justice is on everyone who's impacted. The traditional process produces defensiveness. And I notice that more and more as our kids are told by parents, don't talk to the school resource officer, don't talk to the administrator, because parents are afraid of their kids being charged, before they even know about it. And so there's this defensiveness that's happened post zero tolerance. I'll never forget a kid that I worked with recently who was being given restorative justice in lieu of a criminal charge, and him and his family had already been to an attorney. These were college-bound seniors who did a dumb prank at the end of the year, and he looked at his dad and he said, "This is where I can tell the truth, right, in the restorative justice process," because he had learned that his attorney told him, say you didn't do it, say you weren't there, trying to avoid a heavy sentence. And so we're teaching kids to lie with these draconian and punitive sentences and discipline processes, where restorative justice really encourages them to tell the truth. We tell them there are some things that we have to tell. If you tell us that you're being harmed in some way or you've harmed someone else, allegations of child abuse, anything like that, we have to tell somebody to keep you safe. But other than that, anything you tell us is confidential. So you're not going to get in more trouble by telling us the whole truth about what you did. And in restorative justice, we tell the kids, you bring your truth and others bring their truth, and they might not be the same. So that's important with honesty. And then the accountability in the traditional process means taking your medicine. We're punishing a lot of people in this country, but that doesn't mean that they're accountable. And we talk a lot about accountability versus punishment in our trainings. So really, accountability means that you've taken your medicine or you've served your time or your sentence, but that doesn't mean that you've learned something. So in restorative justice, it really means taking personal responsibility and having had that apology of action or making things right so that you can repair that harm and move on. So it also really teaches resilience. And then next I have just a little bit of data I thought might be interesting, just to show the growth in the restorative justice program here in FCPS. We have 245 schools and I have a staff of 7. So we're a very small staff and we're spread very thin, but I'm proud of the work that we've done. So these are the students that we've served in the last 3 school years. And so you can see how it's increasing every year. It takes a long time. This is our 8th year of implementation. So we're now up to serving almost 900 students, and I'm sure this year we'll be up over 1,000. This is our recidivism, which is always interesting to folks who work in schools. We know that recidivism is really high with suspension because we have repeat suspensions, and we also know that repeat suspensions, particularly in middle school, triple the probability of kids going into the justice system. So punitive measures like suspension, they're just no longer viable. They no longer change behavior because isolation is a thing of the past. When I was in my generation, when you were suspended, you were at home, you were isolated, but our kids today are so connected. They're not isolated when they're suspended, and so the behavior just continues. So this is just some numbers from between September of 2014 and June of 2016. 1,086 students participated in restorative justice in lieu of suspension. Only 65 of them reoffended within that first year, and of 65, 48 were special ed. So we know that special education students, for them, behavior is developmental, and so they may need more than 1 or 2 circles to be able to change their behavior. So we don't count them in recidivism. So it's usually about 3 and 6% of students that reoffend after restorative justice, as opposed to criminal justice and discipline, which is really high in the 80s and 90s for reoffense. So we're really excited about our recidivism rates. And then a little bit more about our AAP program. It's our cute cartoon that we use from Chicago. So we talk a lot about the collateral consequences of early court involvement with our administrators, and this is always so interesting to them. They're just not aware that juvenile arrests do not go away at age 18. And of course, this is specific to Virginia. It's pretty similar around the country, but court hearings and records are open 14 years and older. If it's a felony, it's open to everyone, remembering that in Virginia, the line between petty and grand larceny is $200 and has not changed in 50 years. So when a kid steals a cell phone, it's a felony that stays on their record for life because it's over $200. And so that's always a big shock to our administrators, who always want to charge kids for stealing cell phones, because they don't recognize that that means a lifelong criminal record for that student. Students can be placed in alternative education, even if they're a straight A student, according to the law in Virginia. College applications, both here and around the country, now reporting any delinquency charges. So what they ask is, have you ever been charged with a crime? You could have been charged with a crime at 14 and it was dismissed, but you have to check yes. And some of our colleges in Virginia told us that they take those applications right off the top because it's checked yes that the kid was charged with a crime, and they don't want them at their university. So even our local community college now does a criminal background check. And so we're really trying to reduce those charges because that keeps kids out of college and away from jobs. Most job applications used to say, have you ever been convicted of a felony? Many of them, including like Walmart, McDonald's, typical places where kids would work, say, have you ever been charged with a crime? That's very different than being convicted. And then, of course, families can be evicted from public housing if their child has a criminal justice charge. So we talk a lot about the collateral consequences of early court involvement for kids as in bringing restorative justice to FCPS, particularly for criminal charges, to try to keep as many students as we can out of the justice system. So the way that we do that is our alternative accountability program that I told you about in that continuum. This is at the higher end of the continuum for criminal charges. So this is something really exciting in Fairfax County we're excited about. This is actually 6 agencies, all the agencies that work with juveniles. It took us many years of meeting and relationship building to get this program off the ground, but our goal, again, is to stop the number of youth in our county that are entering the justice system. So patrol officers can refer juveniles to this program for shoplifting at the mall, and SROs can refer juveniles to the program for things that happen in school or on school property. So that's been a very exciting program. Our police officers love it because they see real accountability happening as opposed to the kids getting a smack on the hand, or particularly this is all for first-time offenses. So this is a front-end program to try to help the kids learn from the situation and not reoffend. So this is our recidivism from the AAP Police Diversion Program. So far, we've had 148 offenders. We've already had 150 this year, so that number is going to go up. And we only have numbers, of course, through the end of last year. And the recidivism rate is 15 to 20%. That's huge because in juvenile court for diversion, it's about 83%. So kids that go through this process and have to sit with their victim and sit with the police officer and walk through those questions with their parents there really don't reoffend at those high rates. So that's our AAP program. And then the last slide that I have here is just our website at fcps.edu. You can go out and there's a general information packet about restorative justice. If you just search restorative justice, it has all of our information, criteria for referral, a good bibliography with research if you want to look more into it. And it also has about a 6 or 7 minute video that actually shows students in a restorative justice process. So that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Vickie. So now we're going to open it up for questions from
Sure.
group that are here. And guys, remember we have a small group, so if you want to unmute yourself or you want to put it in the chat box, I'll be glad to read it out, whatever works for our group. And I do have a question.
Sure.
If it's okay, if I can go ahead and ask this.
Sure.
So, Ondine, do you want to go ahead and ask a question?
Oh, you can go first, Cynthia.
Okay, thanks. So my question is, I am very interested in, the training that you guys provide. So could you talk a little bit about training that you guys offer for those who are in the webinar who might be interested?
Sure. We offer, our training is very specific, of course, to Fairfax County Public Schools. We offer different levels of training. So our teacher training for restorative practices in the classroom, that is a 2-day training where our teachers where my staff, who are all former teachers, their title is Restorative Justice Practitioner now, but they're all former teachers, all certified in special ed. So they're very seasoned teachers. They go out and train the teachers, and that's a 2-day training followed by mentoring the classroom. Because what we have found is even after 2 days of training, they are not ready to implement and facilitate circles. So our staff actually goes in now and mentors them. Our training, that's for teachers. Our training for restorative justice facilitators, facilitate processes for discipline and for criminal justice, that is a much more intense training. We have a very thorough training manual that goes with that training, and that is a year-long training cohort. So they start out with us at the beginning of the year, they learn the basic theory, and then they practice relationship building circles, move on to practicing for attendance groups and things like that, and then move on to facilitating for discipline response and criminal justice. So that's a year-long training. One thing that we're working on in Virginia, and I know is happening in restorative justice across the country, is there's a great deal of concern among the restorative justice movement leaders that there's a lot of work being done to train people in restorative justice, and there's no hands-on, there's no mentoring. You just can't learn this work out of a manual. It's something that has to go. We have to be in there sitting with people while they're facilitating. They have so many questions and they really don't feel prepared. And so the mentoring part is the biggest part of our training. We spend the whole year with them in 4 or 5 different on-site trainings where they're with us for the whole day. But then in between those training days, we go out to their schools and mentor them right there in their classrooms on-site or wherever they're facilitating until they're ready to be on their own. When they are, then we certify them, and then they can move forward and go on their own after that. We still provide them support. So if they're trained as a facilitator and they get a referral from an administrator that has 6 students and 6 families involved, they clearly need a co-facilitator. They'll come back to our team for a co-facilitator. So even though we're training and certifying them, we still make sure we provide them with that support and backup if they get a large case or a very complicated case, or if their neutrality is compromised because they're too close to the students involved, then we can send one of our facilitators in to be a neutral facilitator. So our training is very inclusive. Our facilitator training also includes Trauma 101 training to recognize trauma in students. It includes victim sensitivity training, cultural diversity training, and so it's all just professional development mixed in with a lot of facilitation practice.
Great.
That was a long answer to your question.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. Okay, so Ondine, you had a question.
Okay, I'm going to see if I can take the, oh, hi.
Hi.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you. Lighting is weird, but thank you. I'm going to turn this around so you can see me. Thank you so much. This was fascinating and so impressive and so together what you're doing in Fairfax. And I really hope that this becomes a nationwide movement. I know that restorative practices are, popping up everywhere, including where I am in Champaign, Illinois. But you guys are really ahead of the curve with the systematic approach, the training, the thoroughness. I'm so excited that this is being recorded because I have about 5 people in my mind who I'm going to direct to this webinar. So thank you. I guess today in the news in my community, there was I just retired last May from being a school psychologist in a high school. And, high school of about 1,400 kids in Champaign, Illinois, pretty diverse, lots of socioeconomic diversity, things like that. And the town itself has had some struggles with harmony, racial harmony, things like that. And there was a consent decree in the school district and things like that. But anyway, just today there was something about a fight, and the news said gangs were involved, and then, you know, the Facebook comments start. And a lot about, you know, it's always the law and order and, oh, you know, this and that, and soft on crime and zero tolerance. And I was just wondering what kind of resistance you might have encountered with the people who really believe that, you know, toughening up and having stricter rules and not letting kids get away with stuff. How do you respond to those comments?
Well, that's what we hear all the time, as you can imagine. First of all, to say it's very clear, every study that's ever been done, research study on zero tolerance post-Columbine, including by the Harvard School of Civil Rights, has indicated that zero tolerance was a dismal failure around the nation. It has created a whole generation of incarcerated youth. It does not change behavior. Punishment, countries who have the, you know, the most severe punishments have the highest crime. So first we start with the research to indicate that it does not solve the issue. The other thing we talk a lot about is that doesn't change behavior. You can punish people, and you can kick them out for 5 days of the building, or you can put them, you know, somewhere else. The thing is, they're going to eventually come back. 85% of kids who are removed from school are going to come back as are offenders into the community. And so that law and order it's almost like violence and revenge is that instant fix. You know, it fixes it. It gives violence and, you know, violence and hate do inspire an instant gratification. You know, something happens right away. We've done something about it. Where something like restorative practices take a little bit more time and a little bit more investment, but the results are absolutely different. You're going to have a much better result with that. And usually when we can talk about research with people who are resistant, we can talk about how punishment doesn't change behavior. Usually they start to agree. But actually the biggest way to change hearts and minds we found in our county is one circle at a time. It sounds kind of silly, but really it's that resistant teacher who just, you know, who is extremely resistant to this and says, I've been teaching for 20 years and, you know, this stuff is BS and I want that kid out of my classroom. One circle, and we can almost always get that teacher to buy into restorative practices and restorative justice, because you really see the change happening right there in front of you. You see the change happening, and you see the behavior change in the child and the resilience that can come from that. So the best way to fight that resistance, we believe, is really by, if we can not talk people into it, because we don't twist arms, it's a voluntary process, but if we can explain the process in such a way that allows them to just come in for the pre-conference, which is the pre-meeting, so we can explain to them what the process is all about. No, it's not based in punishment, but here's what we try to do, and then get them into that final circle. They see that what they really wanted in the beginning wasn't going to solve the problem, which is to get rid of the kid, is really what they want. And getting rid of the other kid from the classroom isn't going to solve the problem. So I would say that that's the biggest way we can get people to participate and understand. But then there are also just a certain population, a certain group of people who are always going to want a punitive response, because they believe that that's what should happen. That's what I call proportional revenge. You know, I'm going to do something to you because of what you did to someone else. And also when we talk about proportional revenge, that sometimes gets people's attention. Is that what your intention is? So we'll say to administrators, you know, what is your intention when you're disciplining? Is it to disciple and educate, or is it simply to punish? That usually gets their attention too, and offers them food for thought.
Yeah, great answers. Thank you. I have another question, Cynthia, but I don't want to hog the webinar in case other people have questions also.
Oh, we got time. Go ahead.
Well, one thing, when restorative justice was introduced, the one question I always had was, I know that, you know, some of the restorative justice models derive from law enforcement and things like that. And in the language of the harm, and starting with the harm. And I guess I feel like, and in some of the work I've done with mediation, especially between teachers and students, I feel like there's a period of time before the harm occurs, that's sort of pre-harm, or maybe a harm occurred, but people don't really agree that, you know, on the harm, or was it a harm, or in whose mind was it a harm, or, you know, is there a shared responsibility for the harm because there was a misread situation and everyone kind of contributed in a weird way. And then maybe taking into account unconscious bias. You know, maybe the child did something, but maybe the teacher also did something. And there was a shared responsibility kind of for the way things turned out. So the one question I always had about the restorative justice model is that it sort of assumes that everyone's on the same page with the harm. Am I reading that wrong? Because, yeah, so am I reading that wrong?
I would say, no, it feels that way, but I would say, first of all, it's a voluntary process. Mm-hmm. So, for example, if we had a group of people who totally disagreed about what the harm was, or one person might say, I feel very harmed by this, and the other person doesn't, then we would ask, are you willing to listen to how the other person feels harmed, even though you don't agree, you know, that person feels harmed. And the way we deal with that in the circle, once people agree to meet together, is that we say, everyone brings your truth, particularly when we're working with young students. It's a little more difficult with adults, but particularly with young students, your truth is going to be different than someone else's truth, because we all perceive our truth through our own personal lens. So we talk about our own lens, and what lens are you bringing with you to the circle today? So we have students who, like, for example, we had, I'll just use an example of a big food fight in the cafeteria, and a couple of students who thought that it wasn't a big deal, and as long as they stayed and cleaned it up. But then there was a student who came from a war-torn country who, when the chaos started, had an asthma attack and almost died because he became so anxious and upset. And so the other kids who were saying this is no big deal, well, that's your truth. But listening to the other students say, well, for me, this was a huge deal because I was terrified. I didn't know what was going on. The country I came from, this is the way people would behave when a bomb had been dropped or something. And so oftentimes one person's truth helps another person see why that person felt so harmed. It brings understanding and empathy. And so, but at the same time, if we were working with a group of people and they said, I don't see where the harm was, I don't agree with them, that they mostly won't participate, or we would say we don't recommend this for a circle. So the pre-conference, we say pre-conference, 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 because that is the most important part of this process. People need to understand what they're walking into. They come in voluntarily with their truth, and we prepare them for the fact that they're not going to agree with everyone else in the circle. So that's typically how we deal with that. That usually is all worked out at pre-conference. And so we don't make an assumption about harm, who's been harmed or how. We don't, our facilitators are trained not to predict outcomes. Whatever the outcome is the outcome of the group. And sometimes it's that we don't agree. We don't agree, but I've at least heard you and understand now that that particular thing I do might make you feel harmed, so I can stop doing it, or something like that. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Yeah, kind of. Thank you.
Anybody else have a question?
Yes, this is Kyle Bruner.
Hey, Kyle.
First of all, I want to say thank you so much for sharing this information with us. I'm so happy to see that you guys are in Virginia. So my question, I've actually got two questions. Question one is, what is the offense that the actual resource officers are allowed to send straight to restorative justice compared to the other ones that they aren't? And my second question is, in the beginning stages of this process, who was your biggest supporter?
So the first question, for the SROs, for the police officers, can refer anything that rises to the level of probable cause that they would normally have written a juvenile complaint for. So that would be stealing, theft, vandalism, destruction of property, fights. We do a lot of disorderly conduct, people, kids pushing and shoving, getting into an all-out physical brawl at school where they might be charged with assault. That's typically mostly what we do. We don't do anything involving any kind of sexual assault. Unless it was something that was minor and both parties agree to sit down and talk about it, or maybe something that was misinterpreted that both parties sit down and agree. But typically that would be dealt by juvenile intake in a different way. And then also it's at the discretion of the officer, and that the student has to be a first-time offender, so they can't have any other priors to be considered for this diversion. So they can't have any other priors, but it's really up to the officer. They can refer almost anything short of a sexual assault or something that was a situation where it was gang involved or gang members committing a crime together or something like that. But typically almost anything we would see in a school can be referred.
Excellent.
The second question that you asked me, you'll have to remind me. The first one, go ahead.
No, the second one was who was it when you first started going through this process?
Right.
Who was your biggest supporter? Because I like to know who would support this program.
And I can tell you who's the biggest supporters: parents. I can tell you parents, because they see their kids are coming home after suspension, and I think they're very concerned. So the parents, absolutely. Right now we have huge community support in our community, particularly with our folks from the NAACP, because of those numbers that are very high in Virginia. You may be aware that Virginia has the highest numbers for the schoolhouse to jailhouse pipeline in the nation. That's one of the reasons that we are trying to reduce that here in our county. So we have great support. Right now there's regional meetings going on provided by a group called our Communities of Trust and the NAACP to look at how this is impacting our racial disparities, because they're here as they are around the country. Also, our disparities in discipline of special needs students of all races. And so parents of those students who've seen how discipline policies under zero tolerance and punitive policies have disproportionately affected students of color and special needs students. So those groups of people who have seen those disparities and are very concerned about them have been great supporters. Also, many of our administrators in our county have been great supporters of restorative justice. Many of our high school principals and middle school principals and assistant principals are looking for another way, looking for something that's a little bit more effective. So I would say those are our two biggest groups: administrators looking for a new way, a different way to deal with discipline issues, and parents who are looking for something a little more reasonable with their children.
Excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have about 3 minutes. So does anybody else have a question they would like to ask Vickie before we end our webinar for this evening?
The questions were so good. Thank you all. This is Karen DeVogue in California. I really, really appreciate all of your time, Vickie. This is tremendously helpful, and I am going to highly recommend many of our colleagues that are in this work listen to your succinct description of policy implementation and best practices. Great. I have a very quick question. I've been working with a middle school class, and we were looking at the book Touching Spirit Bear.
Yes.
Okay. Is there another book that you know of that could tell a similar story?
Yes, and yes, yes. That book is wonderful. That's on the middle school curriculum. There's also a book called "What Are You Staring At?" And it was made in Great Britain, but you can get it on Amazon. Cool. The authors are Pete Wallace, W-A-L-I-S, and Joseph Wilkins, and I've run a restorative justice program in Great Britain, but it's a wonderful book for elementary and those lower middle school grades.
Great.
It's all about two boys who get into a fight. I think it's still in hardback right now, but that's another great resource for kids.
Oh, thank you so much. That's just great. Thank you very much.
Sure. You're welcome.
Great.
Okay, any other questions before we end for this evening?
Thank you all very much.
Oh gosh, Vickie, thank you so much. And I hope that maybe in the future you'll come back and do another webinar for us,
Certainly.
maybe on some, maybe just a specific skill, or, you know, just, gosh, anything.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. It's an exciting movement. I hope to see it grow around the country. So
Absolutely.
thank you for the opportunity.
Oh, you are so welcome. So I'm going to stop recording.